Right after Babel, the Bible does something strange. For 11 chapters, Genesis has been telling the story as wide as the world itself. Creation, Eden, the fall, Cain and Abel, the flood, Noah, the nations, the tower, the scattering of languages, the whole human family spread across the earth. The camera has been pulled all the way back, and the question seems global. What will God do with a world that keeps turning his gifts into fear, pride, violence, and self-protection? Then suddenly, the story narrows to one man. His name is Abram, later called Abraham. He has no kingdom, no army, no land of his own, no visible power, and most important of all, no child. His wife Sarai cannot have children, and the future of his family looks closed before the promise even begins. And yet, this is the man God chooses right after Babel. That timing is not random. The Bible does not move from Babel to Abraham because it ran out of world history and needed a new character. It moves from Babel to Abraham because Babel creates the question that Abraham's story begins to answer. At Babel, humanity says, "Let us make a name for ourselves." With Abraham, God says, "I will make your name great." At Babel, people gather in fear because they do not want to be scattered. With Abraham, God calls one man to leave what is familiar and walk into a future he cannot control. At Babel, humanity builds upward to secure itself without God. With Abraham, God comes down with a promise. And once you see that contrast, Abraham's story is no longer just the beginning of one family. It becomes one of the biggest reversals in the Bible. So why did God choose Abraham after Babel? Was God making the story smaller? Or was he beginning a plan that would one day widen back to every nation on earth? To see it, we need to return to Babel, because Babel is much more than a story about a tall tower. It is a story about human beings trying to build identity, security, and greatness without receiving them from God. The people gather together and say, "Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, or else we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." That sentence gives away the heart of the story. They are not only building with bricks, they are building against fear. They are afraid of being scattered. They are afraid of losing control. They want a center strong enough to hold them together. They want a name great enough to secure their future. They want the kind of unity that comes from one human project, one tower, one ambition, one shared attempt to become untouchable. And that is why Babel still feels modern. The tower may be ancient, but the impulse is not. People still build towers out of achievement, reputation, money, systems, platforms, power, and image. We still feel the pressure to make a name that cannot be forgotten. We still fear being ordinary, scattered, unseen, or dependent. We still think that if we build high enough, organize enough, control enough, and gather enough people around our project, we will finally be safe. Babel is not simply the beginning of different languages. It is humanity trying to manufacture significance apart from God. The problem is not building itself. The Bible is not against cities, creativity, language, architecture, culture, or human cooperation. Genesis has already shown that human beings are made in the image of God, which means they are meant to create, cultivate, name, build, organize, and fill the earth with life. The problem at Babel is the direction of the heart. They are not building as people who trust the Creator. They are building as people who want to replace trust with control. They do not want to receive a name. They want to make one. They do not want to receive a future. They want to secure one. They do not want to spread across the earth in obedience to God's blessing. They want to stay gathered around the monument of their own greatness. so God scatters them. At first, that may sound like God is simply against their unity, but that is not the deeper point. The Bible is not saying diversity is a curse or that many languages are a mistake. Later in Scripture, people from many languages and nations will be part of the hope. The problem is not difference. The problem is false unity built around pride and fear. Babel is unity without trust, achievement without humility, community without surrender, and greatness without God. That kind of unity cannot heal the world. It can only organize human rebellion more efficiently. So the story ends with scattering, confusion, distance, and unfinished ambition. Humanity tried to make a name, but the result is fragmentation. Then Genesis 12 begins, and the first thing God does is speak to one man. That is the surprise. After the nations are scattered, God does not start with an empire. He does not start with the strongest king, the largest city, the most impressive army, or the most advanced culture. He starts with Abram, a man whose future looks impossible. And God gives him a promise that directly answers Babel. He says, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Notice the reversal. Babel says, "Let us make a name for ourselves." God says to Abraham, "I will make your name great." Babel fears being scattered across the earth. God tells Abraham to leave the security of his own place. Babel gathers people into one project of self-protection. God calls one man into a journey of trust. Babel wants greatness that turns inward. Abraham receives blessing that must move outward. This is the pattern most people miss. Abraham is not introduced as a random new beginning after a failed ancient construction project. Abraham is God's answer to Babel. Not a quick answer. Not a simple answer. Not an answer that avoids generations of struggle, but the beginning of the answer. The world has become scattered, divided, afraid, and proud, and God begins a promise that will one day reach all the families of the earth. That phrase matters. All the families of the earth. God does not choose Abraham because he has stopped caring about the nations. He chooses Abraham because he intends to bless them. The story narrows to one man so that blessing can eventually widen to the world. This is the difference between a narrow story and a focused story. A narrow story becomes smaller and smaller until everyone outside is forgotten. A focused story narrows like a lens so that light can be directed somewhere with purpose. Abraham's story is focused, not small. Through one family, God begins to address every family. Through one promised line, God begins to move toward the healing of the nations. Through one childless man, God begins the long road toward blessing that cannot be manufactured by human pride. And that makes Abraham's weakness important, not embarrassing. If God wanted to show that the future depends on visible human strength, Abraham is a strange choice. He does not have what Babel has. He does not have a city. He does not have a tower. He does not have a crowd gathered around his name. He does not even have the son through whom the promise could continue. He has only the word of God calling him forward. That is the point. Babel is human possibility gathered into one project. Abraham is human impossibility held by one promise. Babel says, "We can build our way into security." Abraham's story says, "The future God gives cannot be produced by human power. It must be received by faith." That does not mean Abraham instantly understands everything. The Bible does not present him as a flawless hero who floats above fear, confusion, or failure. He trusts God enough to leave, but he does not always trust perfectly. He follows the promise, but he also struggles when the promise seems delayed. He fears for his own safety. He tries to protect himself. Later, he and Sarai try to force the future through their own plan. His story contains faith, but it also contains weakness. That is one reason it feels so real. God does not choose Abraham because Abraham is already the solution. God chooses Abraham because God is faithful to the promise he gives. The rescue story begins with grace, not human achievement. Still, the first command is costly. Go. Leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house. In the ancient world, those words meant more than moving to a new address. Country meant belonging. Relatives meant protection. Father's house meant identity, inheritance, and future. God calls Abraham to step away from the normal structures that told him who he was and where his life was going. Babel tries to secure identity by staying and building. Abraham receives identity by leaving and trusting. Babel is afraid of being scattered, so it builds a tower. Abraham is called out from what he knows, and he walks without having the full map. That contrast is not only historical, it is spiritual. There are two ways to live. One way says, I must build high enough to prove I matter. I must control enough to feel safe. I must make a name strong enough that no one can forget me. The other way says, I can receive a future from God, even when I cannot see how it will happen. I can walk because He has spoken. I do not need to become my own tower. And this is where the story begins to move under the surface. Abraham is not simply leaving a place. He is leaving the Babel way of life. He is leaving the illusion that security comes from human control. He is leaving the pressure to make his own name. He is leaving the old pattern of grasping for significance. But he is not leaving the world behind. God sends him out with a promise that is aimed at the world. Land, descendants, blessing. Those are the three great pieces of the promise. Land means God will give Abraham a place, not because land is just property, but because God's promise is going to take shape in real history, with real people, in a real place. Descendants means Abraham's future will not end with his own weakness. A childless man will become a great nation, not because his body can guarantee it, but because God can. And blessing is the part that opens the whole story outward. I will bless you, God says, and you will be a blessing, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Land and descendants matter, but blessing tells us where the story is going. Abraham is blessed in order to become a blessing. He receives so that others can receive. He is chosen not as a dead end, but as a channel. And this is where many people misunderstand election in the Bible. When God chooses Abraham, it is not the same as saying, Abraham matters and everyone else no longer matters. It is not God picking a favorite family and forgetting the rest of the human race. The promise itself refuses that reading, because the promise points beyond Abraham from the beginning. All the families of the earth. That means the nations scattered after Babel are still in view. The world God made is still in view. The human family fractured by sin, violence, pride, and fear is still in view. Abraham's election is particular, but its purpose is universal. God chooses one for the sake of many. At this point, which contrast stands out most to you? Babel trying to make a name, or God promising Abraham a name? Write Babel or Abraham in the comments. Because the next part of the pattern shows why Abraham's story cannot end with Abraham, and why the promise has to keep moving until it reaches Israel, Jesus, and the nations Babel left scattered. Once Abraham receives the promise, the Bible does not suddenly become easy. In fact, the promise creates new tension. God says Abraham will become a great nation, but Abraham has no child. God promises land, but Abraham lives as a stranger in the land. God promises blessing for all families of the earth, but Abraham's own household is fragile, complicated, and often full of fear. That tension is part of the story. The promise is not given because the path is obvious. The promise is given where the path seems impossible. And the longer Abraham waits, the clearer the lesson becomes. The future of this story does not rest on Abraham's ability to create it. It rests on God's ability to keep His word. That is why the promise keeps returning. God does not speak once and then disappear. He repeats, confirms, deepens, and protects the promise through moments when Abraham cannot see how it could possibly come true. At one point, Abraham looks at his life and asks the question that has been sitting under the surface from the beginning. What will you give me, since I remain childless? That question is not unbelief in the shallow sense. It is the ache of someone who has been carrying a promise for years while reality keeps looking unchanged. Abraham is not asking a theoretical question. He is asking from inside the gap between what God said and what he can see. Then God takes him outside and tells him to look at the stars. Count them, if you are able. So shall your offspring be. It is a breathtaking moment, because the promise is bigger than Abraham's present evidence. Abraham sees age, delay, barrenness, uncertainty, and limits. God gives him the night sky. And Genesis says Abraham believed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. That line will echo through the rest of Scripture because it shows the heart of Abraham's relationship with God. Abraham does not secure the promise by building a tower. He receives it by trusting the God who speaks. He does not make his own name. He believes the one who promised to make his name great. This is the opposite of Babel. Babel is performance. Abraham is promise. Babel says, prove who you are by what you can build. Abraham's story says, receive who you are by trusting what God says. Babel says, gather enough power so you cannot be scattered. Abraham's story says, go even when you cannot control the outcome. Babel says, greatness comes from reaching upward. Abraham's story says, blessing begins when God comes near. But Abraham's faith is not a straight line without struggle. That matters because if we turn him into a perfect religious statue, we miss the real shape of the story. Abraham believes, but he also fears. He obeys, but he also hesitates. He follows, but he sometimes tries to protect the promise through human strategy. When the promised child does not come quickly, Abraham and Sarah attempt to bring the future about through Hagar, and the result is pain, conflict, and division. The Bible does not hide this because it wants us to see that the family of promise is not naturally pure, powerful, or uncomplicated. God's promise moves through real people, and real people are messy. That does not make their failures harmless. It means their failures are not strong enough to cancel God's faithfulness. This is one of the deepest patterns in Abraham's story. God does not choose Abraham because Abraham can carry the blessing without weakness. God chooses Abraham because God can carry the promise through weakness. That is good news, but it is also humbling. It means the story of blessing is not built on human superiority. It is built on divine faithfulness. The child eventually comes. Isaac is born. and for a moment it seems the impossible has become visible. A childless couple now has the son of promise. But even Isaac does not make the story simple. The promise moves to another generation and immediately faces more tension. Isaac and Rebekah have twin sons, Jacob and Esau. The younger is chosen over the older, but Jacob is not chosen because he is morally cleaner or naturally better. He is a man who grasps, schemes, and tries to secure the future by manipulation. He receives the blessing, but he also has to flee his home. And again, the pattern appears. The promise moves forward, not because the family has become impressive, but because God remains faithful. Jacob becomes Israel, and his sons become the beginning of the 12 tribes. But the family is full of rivalry. Joseph is sold by his own brothers. The promised family nearly destroys itself from the inside. Yet what the brothers mean for evil, God uses to preserve life during famine. Abraham's family goes down to Egypt, and there the small family begins growing into a people. Even this is part of the pattern. The promise does not move forward through a clean path of obvious success. It moves through barrenness, exile, deception, rivalry, slavery, famine, and waiting. Again and again, the future seems threatened. Again and again, God keeps the promise alive. Eventually, Abraham's descendants become Israel, and Israel is rescued from Egypt. That rescue is not disconnected from Abraham. It is the next movement of the promise. God brings Israel out of slavery, makes covenant with them, gives them a calling, and forms them into a people meant to display his character. But Israel's calling is never supposed to stop with Israel. The blessing promised to Abraham still has the nations in view. Israel is chosen, yes, but chosen for a mission. Chosen to live as a people through whom the world can see what God is like. Chosen to become a light, not a wall. Chosen to carry the knowledge of the Creator in a world still marked by the fear and pride of Babel. This is why the Abraham pattern is so important. Babel gathered people around human greatness. Israel was supposed to gather life around God's presence. Babel built a tower upward. Israel received a tabernacle and later a temple where God's presence came down. Babel tried to make a name through self-exaltation. Israel was called to bear God's name with humility, justice, mercy, and worship. But Israel, like Abraham, is not flawless. The people repeatedly fall into the same patterns as the nations around them. Idolatry, injustice, fear, pride, violence, and empty worship return again and again. The prophets confront Israel because the chosen people can begin to look like Babel while still speaking the language of Abraham. That is one of the most sobering turns in the Bible. You can carry the promise and still be tempted by the tower. You can have religious language and still seek security and power. You can know the name of God and still try to make your own name. The story keeps showing that the problem is deeper than geography, ethnicity, or outward identity. The world does not only need a chosen family. The chosen family also needs rescue. Israel needs a faithful representative, someone who can carry the promise without corrupting it, someone who can be the blessing Abraham's family was meant to bring. That is why the promise begins to focus again, this time on a king. God promises David a house and a throne, and the prophets begin to speak of a future ruler, a son of David, a servant, a shepherd, someone who will restore Israel and bring justice to the nations. The promise to Abraham is still alive, but it is moving toward a person who can fulfill it in a way Abraham, Israel, and David's line never fully could. Then the New Testament opens with a genealogy that many readers skip, but its first line is explosive if you know the pattern. Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That is not just a family tree. It is a claim that the promise has reached its turning point. Jesus is introduced as the son of Abraham because the blessing promised to Abraham is coming into focus in him. He is the son of David because the kingly hope is coming into focus in him. The long story that began after Babel has not been forgotten. It has been moving toward this. And when Jesus comes, he does not act like another tower builder. He does not build his kingdom through self-exaltation, fear, or domination. He goes low. He welcomes the overlooked. He touches the unclean. He forgives sinners. He heals outsiders. He confronts religious performance. He blesses where people expected exclusion. He moves toward the very kinds of people human systems often push away. In other words, Jesus embodies the opposite of Babel. Babel is about making a name by rising above others. Jesus receives the name above every name by humbling himself. Babel gathers people around pride. Jesus gathers people through mercy. Babel fears scattering. Jesus sends his followers outward to every nation. Babel's unity depends on control. Jesus creates a new family through faith, grace, and the Spirit. This is why Abraham after Babel matters so much. The pattern does not end in Genesis 12. It reaches into the mission of Jesus. After his resurrection, Jesus sends his followers to make disciples of all nations. That phrase should make us think of Abraham. All nations were never an afterthought. They were already in the promise. The blessing was always meant to travel beyond one family, one land, and one nation. Then, at Pentecost, people from many languages hear the good news in their own tongues. Babel is not simply undone by forcing everyone into one language. Something better happens. The nations are not erased. Their languages are honored. Unity comes not through a tower, but through the Spirit. Not through human pride, but through the risen Christ. The scattered world begins to hear one message in many tongues. That is a beautiful reversal. Babel shows a humanity that cannot create true unity through self-made greatness. Pentecost shows God creating unity without destroying difference, and Revelation carries the pattern to its final horizon. People from every tribe, language, people, and nation gathered before God. That is where Abraham's promise was always going. God did not choose one man to make the story permanently small. He chose one man to begin a blessing that would one day be as wide as the world. So why did God choose Abraham after Babel? Because Babel showed the dead end of human self-exaltation. Abraham shows the beginning of divine promise. Babel says, "Make your name." God says, "I will make your name great." Babel gathers in fear. Abraham goes in trust. Babel scatters the nations. Abraham is chosen for the nations. Babel reaches upward to heaven. God comes down and speaks. Babel leaves the human family divided. Abraham begins the long road toward blessing for every family of the earth. And that means Abraham's story is not only ancient history. It asks a question of every generation. Are we living the way of Babel or the way of promise? Are we building an identity out of fear, control, and performance? Or are we learning to receive our future from God? Are we trying to make a name that protects us from being forgotten? Or are we trusting the God who calls, names, blesses, and sends? Most of us will never build a literal tower into the sky, but we know what it feels like to build a life around proving we matter. We know the pressure to be seen, remembered, admired, secure, and untouchable. We know how easy it is to turn even good things into a tower. Work, ministry, family, influence, knowledge, success, reputation, even religion. Babel is not far away. It is a pattern of the human heart. Abraham gives us another road. Not an easy road. Not a road without waiting, weakness, or unanswered questions. But a road where the future is received as promise, not seized as a monument. A road where blessing is not hoarded, but carried outward. A road where God's choice of one becomes mercy for many. The Bible narrows to Abraham because God's plan for the whole world is just beginning, and the final answer is not Abraham himself. The final answer is the one who comes from Abraham, the one through whom blessing reaches the nations, the one who brings scattered people home to God. Babel tried to make a name without God. Abraham received a name from God. And in Jesus, that promise opens to every family of the earth.